Greetings, please keep eating your hot soup on this nice warm spring day while I welcome everybody and thank you so much for coming. I'd first like to do a few thank yous while you're enjoying your soup, and I'll start with many thanks to our wonderful sponsors for this event, the Aloha Foundation, Hershon and Carter, Scott and McGee, Ledyard National Bank, Lime Timber Company, Snyder Cahoon, Vitt and Associates, A.B. Guile, Artistry, Dan and Witz, and the bouquet on the head table is from the Valley Flower Shop. Thank you all so much. So if you are a board member of the Family Place or a strategic advisor of the Family Place, would you please stand just for 1 second so we can see you and give you a round of applause. And I'd also want to thank so much the staff of the Family Place who worked so hard to make this event possible. Two people who worked especially hard are standing virtuously in the back of the room, not eating any lunch, and they are Hallie and Sasha. Thank you both so much. So as I told you before, the story of the bags. A few years ago, we were looking for a way to keep our time frame in respect for our busy guests and to hear enough from our terrific speakers. Passing various courses took a huge chunk out of our time together. When Rebecca Holcomb was our speaker a couple years ago, we thought of the bags in the spirit of school lunches, since Rebecca was and is our Secretary of Education. It worked so well that we have kept the tradition going. So this year, in keeping with our speaker's position, we hope you will be able to imagine yourself enjoying a sunny camp picnic with your bags. Enjoy lunch, and I'll be back with you shortly. I did forget one thank you, and we want to thank Coventry Catering for the rooms and all of the setup here today. Thank you, Coventry Catering. And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our dedicated and visionary executive director. Nancy Bloomfield came to us at a challenging time, and during her 2+ years with us, she has endeared herself to her staff, her volunteers on the board and beyond, and to the community as a whole. Nancy's warm energy and gentle leadership has inspired us to try to work as hard as she does for families and children. I am grateful to her every day and invite you to join me in thanking her.
Thank you, Posey. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me in the back table? Okay, great. It's really great to see you all. I've recognized people I've been emailing with and talking to over the past couple weeks, but it's really nice to see this group gathered in one place, and I'm so glad that you could make it today, and also really appreciative of you, Chris, for preparing a talk for us. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. So I'd like to just share a brief story before turning the program over to Chris. I think I'll take this up. Here we go. And this is a story that I heard from a couple of our staff in the early intervention program just a couple weeks ago. So a 2-year-old boy, who today I'll call Michael, had been on our early intervention team's radar for a couple of months. His pediatrician had had some concerns about developmental delays in a number of different areas and had made a referral to our early intervention team for an evaluation. But in spite of efforts on many people's parts, his parents had not been interested in engaging in the program, and we weren't able to get in and do an evaluation. So after a few months, Michael and his older sister eventually came into the care of the Department for Children and Families in Vermont, and they were placed with an aunt. And that allowed a door to be opened for our staff and to be able to come in and meet Michael and assess what supports and interventions might be helpful to him and to the family. The trouble was, though, that in Michael's first 2 years of life, he had experienced significant trauma. And specifically, one of the things that Michael's life experience so far had taught him was that if a stranger walked through the door, something bad was going to happen. So when our speech and language pathologist, Sarah Schneider, warm and bubbly Sarah, when she walked through the door, he completely lost control, and he just couldn't handle it. But over the next several visits, Sarah and Michael's aunt had their meetings on the porch. That's where she started. And after several weeks, Sarah was able to start spending time inside the house in an adjacent room, paying no attention to Michael, but playing eventually Legos with his cousins and sort of warming up to the family in general. And eventually, during one visit, Michael's sister, who was also living with the aunt, decided to join in the play. So when Sarah was telling me the story, she said she remembers the moment that changed everything, which is when Michael's sister decided to hand her one of her toys. And at that moment, Michael decided that Sarah might be okay, and over the next few weeks, she was able to begin working with him on his speech. So today, Michael is nearing the age of 3, hasn't been too long, but Sarah's been able to work with him for about 6 months. And Michael will continue to need special education supports as he transitions into preschool and kindergarten. But the good news is that Michael is learning that adults like Sarah can be safe, can even help him have fun, learn, and be successful. Children like Michael need extended family members like his aunt, who was able to step up and take care of him when his parents couldn't. They need skilled and sensitive professionals like Sarah Schneider, and programs like Early Intervention, which works with children and caregivers together, meeting families where they are, responding with flexibility and creativity, expertise, and bringing understanding in complex situations like his. And children in Michael's situation need a community like this. So that's why I am so grateful for all of the support that you all have shown to the Family Place and all the ways that you have shown your caring for children and families in this community, and your commitment through the Family Place, through the work that you do individually and collectively, and in all the ways that you demonstrate that. So thank you very much for being here. I look forward to meeting many more of you in person, hopefully hosting many of you for tours of the Family Place where we can connect a little more personally. Thank you again very much.
And now, I'm proud to have the chance to introduce to you my friend and the executive director of the Aloha Foundation, Chris Overtree. You can all read his impressive credentials on your program, but I will take a minute to give you a bit of the inside scoop about Chris. After all, his mom and I were campers together in Fairleigh many moons ago. Chris first came to Fairleigh from Texas at age 13, and he immediately loved Lanakila. He did what all growing boys at camp do. They come back and they learn to be a counselor while simultaneously becoming an indentured servant in the kitchen and dishwashing room. Chris's professional specialties include parenting, children and families, and when he left the clinical world to return to head Aloha, he embraced a chance to use all those clinical skills, plus a number of others, like writing, budgeting, strategic planning, fundraising, calming nervous parents, curing homesickness, and cooking s'mores. When I asked Chris what I should say in this introduction, he suggested that I remind you that he is a recovering professor. That he lives on a dirt road up a big hill in Thetford with his wonderful wife Heidi and their own homegrown parenting lab, 4 children under 8. He also says his new hobby since moving to the Upper Valley is winching his minivan out of snowbanks. Without further ado, my friend Chris Overtree.
Just need a moment to turn this on. What Posey did not say is that the place where I do the most winching is in my driveway. seem to do better on the road. So just 1 second here. Apologies, we didn't want this running the whole time.
Doesn't work.
He tested this. So let me tell you what I mean by being a recovering professor. I'm going to try a different cable. I'm used to lecturing in front of people who are eating as a professor. It's actually a lot worse. What I'm not used to is being in front of a crowd where I can make references to the 90s, which is nice. Because about 10 years ago, that became impossible with the college population I was working with. So. Okay. All right, so it was the cable. Here we go. Now, I used to be a clinical psychologist. I am still a clinical psychologist, but now I'm a nonprofit director. And a lot of people ask me, why did you leave psychology? I don't think I have. I've used those skills every day as an executive director. Probably, other than perhaps Posey, the only other boss that I had who was so significant and important in my life was actually a primatologist. So the specialty in human behavior can be quite enriching no matter what you're doing. So I'm really excited to be here. I was here at this talk last year and really engaged with what Charles Whelan had to say. And I want to draw some connections to what I'm going to speak about today to what he talked about. But first, I want to tell you about a girl that I'm going to call Margaret. And Margaret was an 8-year-old girl who arrived at my office doorstep with what seemed like a really, let's call it simple, case of attention deficit disorder. And now this has obviously been a condition that you've heard a great deal about. There's a lot of research about it. There's medical interventions, there's behavioral interventions. There are emerging interventions that cross into some pretty amazing territory. In her case, what she faced was an inability to sit still in school, despite the fact that she was able to read 2 or 3 grades above age level. She was unable to get a good night's sleep, in part because she spent each night jumping on her bed until 1 a.m. is what I found. She lived with a single mother, and her father was incarcerated. And during the course of the time I was treating her, her father actually died in prison. And so I had the difficult moment to be working with Mom about how she would be told that, because that was obviously something that she didn't find out right away. And what I learned about treating Margaret was how often the external variables that are not part of the clinical intervention play a large role in the efficacy of the treatment. And what was frustrating to me as a psychologist is I had spent so much of my work and training learning how to control for all those variables so that we could come to the conclusion that a particular treatment might work. So imagine doing research on the efficacy of treatment for ADHD, but removing children who had a history of trauma in order to make the intervention stand out as being impactful. It's a very useful, important, and appropriate research technique to control for these variables. But when you move out of that research setting and into the clinical world and you start working with somebody like Margaret, you realize how important thinking about the other pieces of what goes into somebody's upbringing. So I was here last year. Charles Whelan did an amazing talk, and in some ways, I feel like it's the prelude to this talk. So if you weren't there, I'll just give you the take-home message, which was that every dollar of early intervention monies that have spent pays back 7. And that, in fact, in our country, we tend to react later to problems that have gotten bigger than they were when they started. And it was just such an important point to be made, especially by someone who had the skill and ability to make it in a way that probably seems obvious to many of us, but it's nice to have some numbers around it. We know where the smart money should be, and it's an earlier intervention, and yet it is very hard to convincingly articulate how to go about doing that. What I hope today is to kind of follow this talk by talking about what some of the clinical implications of that early intervention might look like. What does it look like on the ground when it's happening? What are the things that clinicians are facing? The alternative title to this talk might be what clinicians can't do for you by the time you get to adolescence and adulthood if you haven't had that kind of early intervention. So what's interesting is we're talking about early intervention. What we're really talking about is prevention done early. And our health system has a very difficult relationship with prevention. And in psychology, it actually has, there's a lot of research about it that tells us why that is. We have cognitive biases that are probably evolved that make it much easier for us to spend money on what's in front of us than it is to speculate and spend money as an investment. This is why the financial sector forces you to do certain things in order to save for retirement, because we wouldn't do it. A study that was done I thought was really interesting. And you ask people, what kind of foods are you going to eat over the next week when you have snacks? 74% would say fruit. So, planning for the future. If you give them a choice for a snack to have now, 70% choose chocolate. Right then and there. And we're just not good at making these predictions. We're not good individually in our own lives. We're not good as a society. We can probably expect that our voters will not always reward us for having a preventative mindset. And so it is a very challenging dilemma, and it has its roots in how the brain works, how we make decisions, the cognitive biases we follow. And it's something we really need to factor in. Now, Charles Whelan talked about that $1 to $7 ratio. You know, we here know that there are faces that are attached to it. This is one of our program participants at Aloha Hive. These are the kind of faces that I look at when I'm thinking about how are we going to be positioning ourselves to be impactful in those lives. We all can benefit from this kind of investment. So I'm going to take you back to the 1980s, 90s, something I have not been able to do as a professor in a long time, and remind you that in the 80s and 90s, particularly in some of the inner cities in this country, there was a crack cocaine epidemic. And just like the heroin epidemic, it had a lot of its roots in the kind of the economic factors connected to crack cocaine, how available it was, with respect to other drugs, you know, how you could obtain it. Similarly with heroin, we see that, you know, in some ways it is a cheaper drug than some of the other earlier medications that are being abused. And one of the things that happened in the 80s is people were interested, what is going to be the long-term impact and how can we study it? So Dr. Helen Hurt, which she was at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She started a longitudinal study in 1988, and she was looking to follow the long-term impacts of this prenatal addiction. And obviously, going into it, in particular if you listen to her talk or read about her, she's still practicing. She was really trying to kind of emphasize what the importance of this earlier intervention around prenatal addiction might be, by also showing what the impact of that would be on the longer term development and outcome for children. What was shocking, what she did not expect, what many of us clinicians did not expect, is that when she looked at the deleterious outcomes, being born addicted to crack cocaine did not predict them. So you follow? It was a variable that was unrelated to the outcomes. And it was baffling. And this is where the importance of the variables you control for comes in. The variables that you allow to be part of your study and the variables that you don't. Because there was one variable that predicted outcome. Does anybody know what it was? Poverty. Poverty held all of the explanatory power for outcomes in these inner city children, regardless of whether they had been born addicted to cocaine. This was an amazing finding, and I would suggest that it was, for me, a bellwether to the notion that we as clinicians might be fighting against a tide that was going to overwhelm us just like anybody else. And I can just say personally, it caused me to question the value of social work versus clinical work. And for a lot of clinicians, the value of spending money on interventions that come after the problem versus prevention. And so you see how this study really powerfully kind of taught us something, and that is, well, first of all, let's think about it from this perspective. The unbelievable resiliency and adaptability of the human brain. That children who had the right kind of upbringing could have the same kind of positive outcome as anybody else, as long as something as the effects of poverty were contained or somehow addressed. That's a very powerful finding, and it's going to come through later when I talk about policies that, at the roughest sense, don't cost anything, and how they can be thought of as earlier intervention strategies expressly by taking advantage of the resiliency, the adaptability, and to use the neurological term, the elasticity of the child brain, its ability to adapt and respond to challenge. So what we found is that we were watching our patient populations becoming increasingly difficult to access. Finding that insurance was lapsing, and it's interesting that in this day and age where we're talking a lot about Obamacare and the transition that may or may not come, even back then, the key here was interruptions in treatment or the inability. We also found about compliance. When I think about some of the behavioral interventions that I might want to put in front of my patient, Margaret, they required a certain level of ability, a certain level of follow-through, a certain level of money in order for this girl's mother to be able to do what evidence said she needed to be able to do in order for her daughter to recover. And these factors, this social context, clearly and immediately became much larger than all of the tools that I had at my disposal as a clinician. That I had to somehow find a way to fix those things, control for those things, account for those things before the treatment that I knew could be effective could work. And this is why I had guidance counselors driving kids to therapy at my office in the major hospital. This is why we would advocate with insurance companies to allow clinicians to go on the road. And to this day, I don't know of very many billable codes where a clinician can actually go to where the patient is, except in school settings. And of course, school settings are essentially single-payer settings. And that's not the point of my talk, but but the issue is that these factors became so important. I want to tell you a little bit about Julio. This is a short story. Julio was 10. Julio was poor. He lived with a single mother. He had an abusive father and had suffered fairly significant abuse throughout much of his life. He was getting better in treatment with me, his mom was able to get him to treatment, in part because she had a job where she had family sick leave benefits. It's as simple as that. Without that, I would not have seen Julio unless I had been a school-based clinician, which would have been great. But in this case, in the setting that I was seeing him, the fact that she had family sick leave benefits was the key. Until he had his coverage denied. He had essentially had too much treatment. And now this case I treated when I was an intern. And despite what you may think, interns have a lot of extra time. And one of the things I decided to do was do something that you really can't do if you're a full-time clinician, and that is sit down, call the insurance company, wait through all those different buttons and waiting periods, and actually finally get to an insurance person on the other end and have a talk with them. And at first it was a talk about, hey, we're both interested in making sure that Julio gets better, right? Turns out that we didn't share that overriding premise. So then it became a little bit more, if you want to call it an assertive, argumentative, where I realized that I had something that this family didn't have. This family wouldn't have it without my help, and I had the ability to explain, I had the ability to advocate, and in this moment I had the time. And so by doing that, I was able to get Julio additional treatment. And it was as simple as using those resources that thankfully I had. But I knew for a fact that if this mom had been left to engage on this on her own, and a lot of hospitals now have care coordinators that they did not have back when I was in the setting that can provide this, that he simply would have drifted away. It was not financially feasible to pay whatever fee the agency was charging at that time. He would have drifted away. And so I was only able to keep him by exerting that time and effort. And that time and effort is just not always there. And sadly, it's also not paid for and not provided for in our kind of medical coverage. So we think about the notion of a moderated relationship, and not to be too statistical about it, but there are these things that we know to be true. High stress has association with depression. That shouldn't surprise you. And poverty can be thought of as a high stress interaction. Poverty writ large is often thought of as trauma, lowercase t, or as my daughter calls it, downer case. Uppercase T being PTSD-related trauma, lowercase or downercase t, being the kind of trauma that comes from dealing with persistent, daily poverty or difficulty accessing medical care, disadvantaged status through racism, sexism, LGBT status, anything that might bring that about. So this is an obvious relationship, but what is actually true is it's a moderated relationship, and that is stress with high social support has a much lower likelihood of leading to depression than stress with low social support. And so this became key because when I was treating somebody, and I specialize in anxiety, which is similar to stress and child depression, what I realized is that the effectiveness of my intervention, even if I delivered it with pristine integrity, as I hoped I was trained to do, would vary highly depending on these other ancillary benefits. And it shouldn't surprise you that I'm saying this here at the Family Talk Luncheon because the Family Place Luncheon, because in fact this is probably one of the key places where the Family Place has that kind of impact, and where we as community members, parents, grandparents, leaders, voters can be thinking about this. So we see this in gene-environment interactions too. There's the MAOA gene, which is thought of as the gene that seems to be associated with criminality in later life. It is also moderated by poverty level. So that we have these genes that are able to be turned on based on the environmental context. And what we see is that the environmental context that separates on wealth lines often brings about some of these terrible outcomes. And by the way, depression, there are more arrows that follow depression. If it's maternal depression, those arrows start pointing to new and different places for the children's in the future. So I got really interested in messy research and confounded interventions. I wasn't interested in controlling so precisely that I could find a very small effect in a particular type of treatment. I was interested in finding a type of treatment or a type of approach that was so powerful it would wash over everything. Now, it was rare that you can find something that can wash over some of the factors that are part of why earlier intervention is needed, but I'll give you one example. If you're going to be treating somebody for ADHD, and you know that one of the most efficacious treatments is a parent intervention, a parent behavioral intervention that's designed to kind of standardize the parenting challenge across school, home boundaries. One of the most effective things you can do is provide childcare, period. The intervention's not going to work without childcare because it will end up, the parents will drop out, they won't come in the first place. And so, ironically, messy research might be, instead of just running your controlled trial on parenting interventions, figure out a way to fund or write it into your grant that childcare be part of it, and dare I say pizza. And what we found is that when we added those things, the efficaciousness of the treatment improved. And normally these things kind of get excluded. Now, I also liked, so that's called a naturalistic research. I also got really interested, and this is part of my own story about how I got to Aloha, in school-wide interventions. So one of the things you think about is if you do a targeted reading intervention for struggling readers, and you use an evidence-based approach, you'll find that those struggling readers get better. You can also do a school-wide intervention that has nothing to do with reading and improves the social and emotional well-being of the entire school, something like a trauma-informed school practice, and you'll find that everyone improves in reading. And it's really messy, extremely messy. It can be costly in terms of people hours. And it is not as fundable as a reading intervention that's targeted to low readers. But where's the smart money? A lot of times the smart money is where the mess is. So, back to Margaret. This is kind of what I imagined she was like at home. And this is the part of the presentation where life imitates art, where my slides get a little bit more attentionally challenged. But here we have this. This is what she did all night. So she was exhausted in the morning. Her mom was exhausted in the morning. Her mom had a baby as well. I've already said some of this, but she had extreme difficulty sitting still. She was reading above grade level. Apparently she had read all of the books in the grade level she could read that were in her library. Now, that either says something amazing about her or something terrible about her library, or both. But here's a girl I knew to be funny, engaging, have high academic aptitude, and yet had some debilitating symptoms that were going to get in the way, absolutely going to get in the way of her educational outcome. And for those of you who don't know this, the social outcome for ADHD in some ways exceeds the academic, because the academic learning can happen in so many different ways, but if you are challenged, as children with ADHD often are, in the social arena, that brings on its own kind of chronic problems. Here's what I haven't read. This is the part that, as a clinician, I can't do much about, right? This is the part that I was trained to kind of ignore if I'm looking at a research protocol for the treatment of ADHD, but as a clinician in the field, it is so obviously key. And just knowing that certainly the moment when her father was incarcerated was a trauma with a capital T, but also the moment that she found out about him passing would also be a trauma. Suddenly I have a child with ADHD who has an emerging trauma profile as well. The key here is that this mom had health insurance. But here's some things that we know. I know that the evidence base tell me that a parenting intervention and the behavioral realm, which is essentially kind of training or retraining parents to respond to ADHD differently. ADHD, in some ways, is just one of many kind of variations in how the brain processes information. And so parents just need one of many variations on the way you approach children about problems. It can be quite normalized if you approach it correctly. She needed differentiated instruction. She needed some of that same additional help in school. Now, I had access to both of these environments. I had the benefit of working with a psychiatrist. We also had the medical piece, but we could not factor in the real world problems. We couldn't get her to her appointments. The type of treatment that she had at school changed every year. And it was on the chopping block every year, in town meetings and in taxes and in the insurance changes. We were never quite sure what she might be able to get. Oh, and by the way, she had not had any early intervention. This is kind of the point of the alternative title of my talk. This is where I'm left when she hasn't had some of these early interventions. Precise monitoring and dosing of the medications for ADHD. Now at the time, Ritalin, you took it 3 or 4 times a day, usually 3, and it did require more precision than some of our medications do now. But that is precision that is hard to come by in a chaotic family environment. And this is something we saw when we tried to bring a lot of the early HIV medications to other countries. Just the cultural differences for how they managed time or refrigeration made them much more harder to deploy than they were here in the US. And there was a missing variable, and with Margaret, there was a very interesting missing variable. So this is what her treatment protocol looked like. So Ritalin plus Ambien. So the idea was that she needed sleep, she couldn't get sleep, she needed sleep medication at night, plus therapy. I tried to choose a balding therapist so that it was more realistic. Plus differentiated instruction. This is a picture, if you Google timeout, this is what you get, a little girl sticking her tongue out in timeout. And in fact, schools are much better at figuring out the differentiated instruction piece, but in general, it comes from school-wide interventions. Maybe you remember your own childhood or the childhood of your kids where your school course depended on which teachers you got. And that is less and less true as we think in more of a holistic sense. And that's where you see some of the school-wide interventions, responsive classroom or PBIS, things like that coming around where it's more of a cultural. So what I realized is that there was a missing piece. Now here's the funny thing about it. I got to the point where she could get to appointments. I got to the point where she had enough supports that mom could start getting some additional help. But there was one thing missing for Margaret. And it was as simple as soccer. I found out that Margaret was an extremely athletic girl, had the kind of wind to run forever, had that kind of ballistic energy and explosion that a lot of young athletes may have. And she had never played soccer. She had never played any organized sports. She had never been able to afford them. Her mother had never been able to take time off from her second job to take her. Right? You see where this is all coming, right? And here as a clinician, I start to wonder, how do I use my time? In this case, I use my time to partner with the United Way. Because what I realized, more ADHD slides, that for mom, soccer was money plus time plus a car plus a babysitter. And none of these things came easy, and they all are somewhat connected to our ability to provide families the kind of basic early support they need to take advantage of the unbelievable resiliency and elasticity that children can present when they're given the opportunity. And I used to work with a special school for children struggling with mental health issues, and they developed a very simple intervention. Children with ADHD who wished to, when they could get to school early and jog around the track, and they could earn points for jogging around the track. And research tells us that athletic endeavors is very helpful with all mental health problems. That's the first good news for everybody here, and particularly for attention deficit. So when we see that we have funding available for treatments and medication that are there to address the problem, but we don't have funding necessarily for things that might prevent it, that becomes a problem. I think about the state of Act 166 in Vermont right now, and I think about the kind of investment that goes into early preschool education, 3 to 5. My daughter is in a preschool and had the advantage of being identified early to have something which turned out to be nothing. But thankfully, because we have access to things like that, we can ask these hard questions. We can pursue these interesting paths. If it had been something, we would have been starting to work on it at age 4 instead of 6, 7, or 8. You know, it's interesting because I told you that early intervention is also equal to prevention, and I just want to point out one of the interesting things is, you know, as we've seen changes in the healthcare system and pay for performance connected to medicine, so the idea that hospitals get their funding by treating their patients based on the efficacy, not based on the number of times they come into the emergency room. And yet, if you want to prevent an emergency room visit for somebody with COPD, particularly an older adult, an air conditioner at $250 is going to prevent at least one $10,000 emergency room visit. But try to find an insurance company that will, or a hospital that will pay for an air conditioner, and actually, some hospitals are actually doing that. They're realizing that it actually makes sense for them to pay someone to go and walk somebody's dog so that they won't leave against medical advice and then come back into the emergency room, because the emergency room's covered, but the dog walking's not. And when you have, again, not a healthcare policy talk, but when you have the ability to have more access to funds to deploy sensibly in all sorts of preventative ways, and again, I know we're talking about children here, but this is a great example for older adults, just to remind us that prevention is everywhere. Opportunities are everywhere. So the last thing I wanted to say before I let you finish your lunch, if you haven't finished, is pure policy. What's the impact of pure policy? And what I mean by this is laws, norms that establish the playing field. Now, I know all policy comes with some cost, but I want to talk about a pure policy that probably had very little cost other than thought time. Because what they do is, even without funding, when we have equal protections, and I'm going to talk about LGBT policy for a minute, when you have equal protections, you take advantage of one of our biggest resources, which is that adaptability, that resiliency, that elasticity in children. They can adapt to so many things. That's why we're still here for now, because humans are really good at adapting. And our brains are unbelievably adaptable. Those skills go away when they're under deep, debilitating, and daily assault. And that's what poverty is. That's what trauma with the lowercase t is all about. And so I want to talk about gender identity. So the Obama administration released something called the Dear Colleague letter, which was very simple. It said, when you're reading the non-discrimination laws and you see the word sex, we want you to make sex and gender identity equivalent. And just think of think of schools as being bound to treat people with fairness and inclusiveness irrespective of their sex or their gender identity. The Trump administration reversed that stance. And what that does is it removes the context for which, in this case, transgender children can thrive. And you may know that the transgender community has a very high rate of suicide. It's actually quite a normal rate of suicide in accepting communities and families. So the idea that there's a direct connection between being transgender and suffering from suicidal thoughts is another example of a moderated relationship. Being transgender in a supportive community is no more associated with these debilitating outcomes as anything else. It's that second variable, and that's the variable that policy plays. And it's as simple as a Dear Colleague letter. So, what you see, data, 77% of transgender youth ponder suicide. This is from a study in Canada. 93% drop if they have a supportive family. It's really simple. There's no actual direct connection that is not moderated by poverty or discrimination or some other variable that we can control somewhat through policy. And I say somewhat with some actual data. When I was doing school climate work and we were measuring the outcomes, here's what we found. We could move the needle on racism. We could move the needle on sexism. We could move the needle on anything that had federal protections attached to it. We couldn't move it on LGBT status. We couldn't move it on body size. If you think about bullying in schools, which is an area, body size, we could not address that kind of issue. There is some benefit to having these norms that come down in policy. So I want to close with just a thought exercise and then a comment about the family place. John Rawls, the veil of ignorance. The idea that if you're trying to think about distributive justice, if you're trying to think about how you're going to allocate scarce resources, that you should do it from behind a veil of ignorance. That you should imagine that you are going to join the society that you're designing without knowing whether you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer, a poor person, a wealthy person, a man or a woman, a gay person, a straight person. That if you adopt policy that you would be willing to join that society even before you knew who you were going to be in it, that you have taken advantage of the veil of ignorance to design a just and equitable policy. And I just invite you to think about how would you spend society's scarce resources from behind that veil of ignorance if you did not know where you or your children or your grandchildren would land. How would you do that? Now, this is one of those preaching to the choir moments, but we all have the capacity to take this knowledge forward in a lot of different ways in a lot of different venues. And I want to just close by saying how I think the family place fits into all of it. And I'm drawn to this quote from The Catcher in the Rye. Anyway, I keep picturing all these little kids playing some game in this big field of rye and all. Thousands of little kids. And nobody's around. Nobody big. Except me. And I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliff. I have to catch everybody if they start to go over the cliff. If they're running and they don't look where they're going, I have to come out from somewhere and just catch them. That's all I do a day. I'd be the catcher in the rye. I know it's crazy, but it's the only thing I'd really like to be. Nobody big, that's us, that's policy, that's government, that's early intervention, that's spending, that's funding, that's schools. Some crazy cliff, that's poverty, or trauma, or the learning disability that a child has at birth and isn't discovered until they're 10. And I think Family Place is the catcher in the rye in this community. And a lot of our other organizations are too. They're here, they're doing this good work, and we need them so badly. But we also need something different, a different kind of thought about how we integrate what Family Work, what Family Place, and others like it are doing to respond to these crises, and think about how we do it earlier, how we do it better, how we do it smarter. So it's been a super privilege to be here, and I gladly take questions or let you have dessert, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was amazing. The statistic about cocaine and poverty and the difference of those outcomes just staggers me. I think that's amazing. In light of the time, I think I'm going to invite you to do some table conversations. And if you have questions for Chris, he'll be here. Come on up and visit with him. But at each table, we have either a strategic advisor or a board member hosting the table, and they would love to invite you in a minute, but not yet, as we say in camping, to share your thoughts for a few minutes before we depart. We want a chance to reflect together on the issues Chris has raised. But before we do, a couple of important points. At this point, folks always ask, how can I help? Financial help is always wonderful, especially at this time of government uncertainty. That's one way. Another way, come find out more. Do fill out the form on your table. Join us for a tour, and we have 2 tours scheduled specifically for you, and you'll see that information on your table. If you can let us know you're coming, great. Or if you are suddenly free at those times, just stop by and join us. Number 3, spread the word about the essential work the Family Place is doing across the Upper Valley and beyond. Number 4, run in the Covered Bridges Half Marathon to raise funds for the Family Place. Just go check out the Covered Bridges website to register for the Family Place team. Number 5, buy pizza on Wednesdays from Dan and Witt's during this month and raise money for the Family Place. So that table talks can go on just as long as you like at each table, I will say now, thank you so much to our inspiring speaker, to all who have helped make this event possible, and to each one of you for joining us together, supporting the Family Place in so many ways. Please take a pinwheel from your table if you like, but leave the glass. And thank you so much for joining in Table Talks, and we will see you, if not before, at the Gingerbread Festival.